All right, welcome back. We are on the female reproductive system. This is lecture 3 of a 4-part series. I mentioned in the last lecture that the females can be just a little bit more complicated naturally, right? Females are more complicated, but ultimately super independent reproductive systems between male and female, both extremely interesting. We're just going to hit on the female a little bit more just because this is kind of where fertilization happens and different cycles happen for sexual activity. When it comes to being sexually mature, the female takes a lot longer and it's more complicated, whereas males produce a lot of semen all day long, every day from the point of puberty. Females, it takes a little bit longer. It's a little bit more complicated process. So the gamete of a female is the oocyte or the egg. It's interesting because out of meiosis, cytokinesis is unequal. And so there's this little thing called a polar body, essentially non-functional. But for whatever reason, there's a unequal cytoplasmic division. And so the egg is quite large relatively, and the polar body is very small. The interesting thing about egg meiosis is, remember from meiosis from males, we have 4 viable sperm from one stem cell. We're going to have 4 viable sperm coming out of that. All of these have the potential to fertilize an egg. For females, only one of these is going to be viable for fertilization, and that egg is ovulated. We're going to talk about that, but it's released into the female reproductive tract in order to potentially meet a sperm, but only 1 out of 4 actually make it to that point, which is really interesting. Your body has a lot of checkpoints that goes through that to pick a egg that is healthy and viable and potentially going to produce a healthy embryo. So oocytes mature in the ovaries, just like sperm mature in the testes. And I'm going to make a lot of analogies here between male and female reproductive tract, things that organs that are similar in both, similar function. Something to note, we're not going to go into a lot of embryology here, but something to note is that the sexual organs of male and female come from the same initial tissue. It's just dependent upon the presence of testosterone or estrogen on how those things are going to develop or differentiate. And so that is why the female reproductive tract is very analogous to the male reproductive tract, because those things arose from the same type of embryonic tissue. So eggs, there's only about 300 to 400 released over the reproductive years, whereas males can make like 400 million sperm a day, but only 300 to 400 are released over the reproductive years, which is typically like, it's different for everyone, right? But I'm just going to say like age 12 to age 50, we'll say. So 300 to 400 eggs released in that time period. The formation of eggs is called oogenesis, whereas in males it was spermatogenesis, so formation of new eggs. Females are born with as many potential eggs as they're ever going to have. These are called oogonia. So that's the stem cell of the female. So in the embryo, we have about 6 to 7 million primary oocytes. So this is meiosis 1. We've started meiosis 1, and we come out with 46 chromosomes here, and that's called the primary oocyte. Then from birth to puberty, right? So from the embryo, this is when you're in development. By the time you're born, this number decreases to only about 200 to 300,000 eggs. Why? Why are eggs destroyed? Your body has a lot of checkpoints that checks for viability, good genes or bad genes being passed on. Maybe an egg just isn't stimulated by hormones anymore. It could be a lot of different things, but ultimately the number decreases X-fold, right? So from birth to puberty, you have about 200,000 primary oocytes. By the time you start ovulating, which is your reproductive years, so female puberty, now we've completed meiosis 1, so now we have 23 chromosomes, which should light up in your mind as being mature, right? Able to be fertilized, right? 23 chromosomes, that's good. That means that we can be fertilized because we don't want to fertilize a 46 chromosome egg. So that happens during ovulation, and meiosis II actually doesn't happen in a female until fertilization by the sperm happens, which is really interesting. It'll start here, but if it's fertilized, then it will complete. If it's not fertilized, it won't proceed through meiosis II. So interestingly enough, 1 egg per month is ovulated. The rest of them are destroyed. So that is how this exponential decrease happens. Multiple eggs, oocytes are maturing, but only one is going to be mature enough to be ovulated. And it takes 1 egg 300 days, almost a whole year, to ovulate. So the eggs that you are ovulating today, ladies, almost a year ago, those started undergoing their maturation process. And again, this is from the newer textbook, but approximately, anywhere from 300 to 500 eggs, just depending on reproductive years, are going to be ovulated over the course of that. Now, to complicate things a little bit, these eggs develop in what's called a follicle. You can think of a follicle as like a sac around the egg. And so there's also folliculogenesis. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail because it can get quite confusing, but ultimately there's going to be some cells that develop around that egg simultaneously while the egg is maturing. And the follicle is important for if pregnancy occurs, but also to kind of house and protect that egg until ovulation happens. So ultimately though, in the embryo, there are primordial follicle primordial oocyte, which is the stem cell in what we call a primordial follicle. That's as early as you can get, right? That's as immature as you can get. The primary follicle will develop once it gets a set of cells around the egg here. And that just has a little bit larger oocyte. So that oocyte has grown a little bit. And at this point, we start to develop FSH receptors, which is good, right? So FSH is necessary for follicular development, and follicular development is important to be able to ovulate each month to make you fertile, right? And so that makes sense that the FSH receptors would occur at this point, because now we have a 23 chromosome egg that's going to fit into that follicle. FSH is going to stimulate the rapid growth of that follicle then into a secondary follicle, and then secondary follicle here, and then a tertiary follicle here. At the tertiary follicle point, we are just about ready to ovulate. They call it a Graafian follicle that's about to ovulate. And essentially what happens is that follicle wall will burst and the fluid and the egg will be expelled. This corpus luteum is what's left over of that follicle, and I'm going to talk about that in maybe lecture 4 about the purpose of that. But ultimately what you have, all I really need you to know is that the follicle is developing with the developing egg. As the follicle matures, it gets bigger and has more cells contributed to it. All of these layers, we're not going to get into all that in this class. Your book goes into detail if you are interested. All right, where are the ovaries? They are in the pelvic cavity. A lot of women don't realize that the ovaries actually sit kind of, they wrap around to the back, to the posterior, which in a lot of pictures, it almost looks like they're coming anterior this direction, but they don't. They actually wrap around posterior. You have 2 ovaries, just like there's 2 testes, one on each side. They are in the abdominal cavity. Think of the ovaries as undescended testes, and then they differentiated due to the absence of testosterone. Testosterone was never released because this person did not have a Y chromosome. So they are enclosed in a sac called, if there's a sac around this, which there is a sac around this, but it's called the tunica albuginea, which is the same thing that encloses like the scrotum, what the scrotum would be made of. That encloses each ovary, and they are covered and suspended by lots of ligaments, but this major ligament that kind of covers the entire uterus, ovary, and uterine tubes is called the broad ligament. So the broad ligament is a huge sheet of connective tissue that's going to lie over the top of all this and just basically hold it in place. The suspensory ligament is here, and that's going to attach the ovary into the uterine tube. This one's detached, but this suspensory ligament would go in here into the uterine tube, which is also called the fallopian tube. That's an older term. And then also the ovarian ligament suspends the ovaries out from the uterus this direction. So that kind of gives it its shape. So some ligaments to be aware of. The broad ligament kind of covers everything. The ovarian ligament goes from uterus to ovary, and the suspensory ligament attaches the ovary to the uterine tube. They descend similar to testes, they just don't descend as far. They can live inside the pelvic cavity with no problem. There's a medulla and a cortex, which up until this point, you should be very familiar with the medulla and cortex. The cortex is going to be the outer part of this ovary. The medulla is going to be the inner part. All of the kind of like with the sperm, all of the most immature egg cells are going to be out here, the oogonia, the stem cells. They're going to mature kind of inwards and towards the medulla. The medulla also has the blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, nerves, things like that kind of innervating it as well. This is an ovary with several different types of eggs in it. So here's all the primordial follicles out here, very small eggs with very small sacs around them, very small follicles. So these are all primordial. And then as they mature, they will become like a primary follicle. And then here's a very large tertiary follicle. All right, so the uterine tubes then come off the ovary here and connect the ovary to the uterus. They're approximately 10 centimeters, you have one on each side. And that basically allows the pathway. So once the follicle ruptures with the egg here in the ovary, that egg is released into that uterine tube and travels through the uterine tube and then into the uterus. A couple things to note. Infundibulum is going to be this area right here. It's kind of like a trumpet area, kind of like a funnel. These little finger-like projections are called fimbriae. Fimbriae are important. So basically what happens when this egg is ruptured from its follicle is these fimbriae kind of sweep the egg into the uterine tube, kind of guide it in there. They do some rhythmic contractions with actually your heart rate. Inside the uterine tube, we also have these little hair-like structures called cilia, which you may be familiar with from the respiratory tract. And basically also we have smooth muscle in here as well that's going to help contract and peristaltic move the egg this direction. That's the goal. Everything's going to sweep and contract to move the egg this direction into the uterus. Something else interesting that people don't realize is that fertilization, where the sperm meets the egg, happens here in the distal 2/3 of the uterine tube. So that's where fertilization happens. And then it's super important that that unit moves into the uterus for implantation. If that fertilized egg implants out here, that is not viable. That is called an ectopic pregnancy, if you've ever heard of that. And the uterine tube is not equipped to house a developing fetus. It can rupture, will rupture if that embryo is not removed surgically. Something else to note that I don't have on this slide, but when you have a sperm meeting an egg, so sperm plus egg is fertilization, that equals a zygote. We call that a zygote. So that the earliest form of an embryo is called a zygote. All right, so hopefully we make it into the uterus where the uterine wall is developed and ready for an implantation of that zygote. It sits over the top of the urinary bladder, which is why when you grow a fetus in your uterus, it pushes down on the bladder and you feel like you have to urinate all the time. This is all the body here. And at the very distal end of the body where we meet the vaginal canal, we have something called the cervix. It looks like a donut shape. There are 3 layers of the uterine wall. So we have going from most deep to superficial, we have the endometrium. Endometrium is going to be the inner layer of the uterus. That's going to be what the zygote attaches to, or the sloughing of that endometrium would result in your menstrual cycle contents. The myometrium is going to be the muscular layer. It's made of smooth muscle. So we know that the uterus can contract involuntarily. So this is all smooth muscle. And then the outside covering is going to be perimetrium. It's pretty fibrous. A couple ligaments that kind of hold this in place. So here's our broad ligament again. Our round ligament is going to attach kind of anteriorly to the pelvic cavity. Uterosacral ligament is going to attach everything posteriorly. So the round ligament is going to attach the uterus and everything kind of anteriorly. The uterosacral ligament will attach it posteriorly. I don't have a picture of that one. So when we zoom in here, here's the cervix, and just something to note that if you've ever watched a pap smear or had a pap smear, when they put the speculum in the vaginal canal, they're looking for a structure that looks like this. That is the cervix. And the opening to the cervix is very small in a non-pregnant individual. As a woman goes into labor, that opening is going to grow to your 10 centimeters that you all know. And that will allow the baby to pass through there. So that's the opening to the cervix. So non-pregnant individuals, very small. As a woman is in labor, that opening will expand. And that's if you're looking inside the vaginal canal, doing like a pelvic exam. So basically the purpose of the vaginal canal is to connect the uterus to the outside, right? The opening to it sits posterior to the urethra, which I'll show you an image here in a second, but it's still anterior to the rectum. The pH of the vaginal canal is a little acidic. It's 3.5 to 4. Remember that the sperm are coming in with an alkaline fluid of about 7.5. So that should buffer out pretty well to keep the sperm alive. Hymen is just a layer of cells here that covers the cervix. It's typically broken with the first sexual intercourse, the use of tampons, really strenuous exercise, something like that. But once that hymen's broken, it's done. It basically is there to protect from like pathogens and things getting into the uterus before sexual activity age. Okay, the layers of the uterus. So we have the mucosa, which is the inner layer with the lumen, and then there are smooth muscle, which provide contractions during like arousal, and then the outside is just fibrous tissue, kind of like the perimetrium. So when you look at the opening to all of this, this is called the vestibule. That's the opening. So we have rectum here, right, anus. Then we have the vaginal orifice. Then we have the urethra. So the urethra does sit anterior to the vaginal opening. Protecting these areas, we've got labia majora and minora. So the majora is going to be these outer folds, and then these inner folds are minora. The purpose of those is to protect this area right here. The clitoris is here. It's the most anterior structure. It is analogous to the penis in the male. Some female babies, when they're born, have a very large clitoris, and it almost looks like a miniature penis, but it is a clitoris and does kind of decrease in size. But ultimately, at the end of that is kind of like the glans penis, where it's has a lot of nerve endings for that arousal. This covering here is analogous to the foreskin to kind of cover that to deter from too much sexual stimulation when not needed. Let's see. So the vestibules here, that's the location of the urethra and the vaginal openings. And there are glands that sit in here that secrete mucus just on either side of the vaginal canal that secretes mucus to kind of help clear things out, but also to lubricate that area. That is going to be analogous to the bulbourethral glands in the male. So remember that the male bulbourethral glands produce mucus to kind of lubricate the exit of semen out to the outside of the body. Kind of the same thing here. So lubrication of penile entry The other reproductive organ that we need to talk about in a female is the mammary glands. So this is going to be the breast tissue. When you look at the breast tissue, there's all these individual lobes here that make up that breast tissue, and each lobe has an alveolar duct coming off of it. And those are going to merge into alveolar ducts that are going to be here. And then we get to lactiferous ducts, which are going to exit to the outside. The areola is this darkened area caused by melanin. Evolutionary purpose of that being dark, and it even gets darker during pregnancy due to hormone response, is that infants can really only see light and dark when they're born. They cannot see color until much later in their development. And so that attracts the infant to their source of food. The nipple is where all of those lactiferous ducts are going to exit and allow milk to exit the breast tissue. Males and females have the same mammary tissue. The difference, estrogen promotes fat deposits into the breast tissue to make them larger. And then pregnancy hormone progesterone, which I'm going to talk about in lecture 4, will help with estrogen to stimulate milk secretion. Male mammary glands do not fully develop under normal circumstances because they don't have high enough levels of estrogen. Let's see, prolactin. Remember prolactin from the anterior pituitary. Remember that prolactin inhibiting hormone typically inhibits prolactin from being secreted until pregnancy occurs. And that is negative feedback to estrogen progesterone. So as estrogen progesterone increase during pregnancy, that kind of shuts off the prolactin inhibiting hormone, and that will allow prolactin to be released and become active. That helps produce the milk in the mammary glands, but does not release it yet. But at birth, we have that super rapid decline of estrogen and progesterone, and that allows prolactin to no longer be inhibited, and that allows our milk secretion to occur. So also milk is let down through oxytocin. So the nipple or the areola is stimulated by the infant suckling. That sends a sensory impulse to the hypothalamus, which tells the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. And oxytocin has a function in labor contractions, but it also has a function in milk letdown. And that contracts all of these glands in the alveolar glands to secrete their milk through the nipple. All right. So moving on here, the very first secretions that come right after birth, within a day or two, is the colostrum, and that is super rich in antibodies and proteins. So if nothing else, if breastfeeding is not in your plan, that's okay. I live by fed is best. So however you want to feed your child is fine. But that colostrum is very rich in antibodies and proteins that they need. And so it is very common that the nursing staff, if you have a hospital birth, that they will try and have you latch at least once to get that into the infant. And then this just goes over the release of milk again with oxytocin. Prolactin inhibits LH and FSH. So usually while you're breastfeeding, you don't ovulate. There's a disclaimer here. So if you don't breastfeed consistently, you absolutely will release FSH and LH, so you could ovulate. So there's this saying that you can't get pregnant while you breastfeed. You absolutely can, especially if you are not routine with it. It's kind of like birth control. If you skip a pill, you absolutely have the chance to get pregnant because you're no longer inhibiting that LH and FSH, and that triggers ovulation. We'll get into that in week 4 a little bit more. But essentially, if you have prolactin, you don't have high levels of LH and FSH being released. But if you do not breastfeed regularly, this will increase, and then you could ovulate and get pregnant. We have some friends who that happened to. She got okayed for sexual intercourse after her first baby, and the first time that they engaged in intercourse, she was breastfeeding, and she got pregnant. So with her second, so they have Irish twins, very close together in age. All right, so that is the female reproductive system. In week 4, we are going to talk about the menstrual cycle, ovulation cycle, all of that good stuff.